Noam Chomsky went on Democracy Now! And he laid out the exact ways that the world is in grave danger.
Do you consider this one of the gravest times in your lifetime in U.S. politics, Noam?
It's one of the gravest times in human history. Humans have been around for 200,000 years. For the first time in their history, they have to decide, and quickly, whether organized human society is going to survive for very long. And that's not in the remote distance. Again, there are two, with all the problems and horrors in the world, which should be attended to, there are two existential threats, both being increased. One is the threat of nuclear war, which is terminal. The other is the threat of severe environmental catastrophe, which doesn't destroy all human life, but does undermine the prospects for organized society. And you mentioned earlier a third threat, also dating back to the end of the Second World War. The end of the Second World War was the opening of the nuclear age. And as I mentioned, it's kind of a miracle that we've survived it. It's also the opening of what geologists are now calling the Anthropocene, the age in which human activity is radically affecting the environment. There's been debate about its origins. The World Geological Society more or less settled on the end of the end of the Second World War, the late 40s and on, where there was a sharp spike and damage to the environment. The third is what's called the sixth extinction, the extinction of species. The fifth extinction was around 65 million years ago, when it's assumed that a huge asteroid hit the Earth and ended the age of the dinosaurs. It destroyed most of the species on Earth. We're now in the midst of the sixth extinction, with very rapid destruction of other species and of the kind of environment in which they can survive, like wilderness, for example. We're pushing to the edge of not only our own survival, but that of much of life on Earth. So is it the most gravest moment in my life? Yes, but also in all of human history. And things like the election next week will have an impact on this.
Yeah, so that's terrifying. That's terrifying. He's saying we have existential threats to human existence, and they include the nuclear war threat and climate change. Now, by the way, I do not know what to do about the threat of nuclear war. Now, I'm obviously a giant proponent of diplomacy and negotiations. I don't believe in the idea, this hardline neocon far-right idea of, like, don't talk to people if they're sufficiently bad because somehow that'll help the situation. No, you're supposed to talk to your enemies and try to figure out to ameliorate your differences and the problems. And yes, it is true that there are some, actors that are so horrific and so terrible that there's no appeasing them. But that doesn't mean that you cut off all communication, because that's a recipe to make the situation worse. So I don't know what to do, though, about, other than diplomacy and negotiations, to work out whatever problems we have with whatever respective governments. And by the way, we're the biggest threat to world peace according to worldwide polling. But I don't know what to do in terms of, like, nuclear disarmament, for example, because I think there's something in human nature that might make that not possible. And that even if, like, okay, we all sign this treaty to reduce and then eventually eliminate the number of nuclear weapons in existence, it's like, all right, well, what if we follow that treaty and then China or Russia or whoever doesn't? And I think every nation is thinking the same thing. Like, oh yeah, we are in theory in favor of doing the right thing, which is getting rid of nuclear weapons, but you first. And, well, actually, you know what? That's not true. It's not that every nation is in favor of it. The U.S. and Israel are openly not in favor of it. They haven't signed on to the treaty to reduce or eliminate the nuclear weapons. So it's not that everybody's even in favor of it in theory, but even if, my point is, even if everybody was, you have a little bit of like a paradox there, where it's like, okay, we all know the world will be much safer if we all get rid of our nuclear weapons and they no longer exist. But the cat's out of the bag and the technology is already possible. Nobody's actually going to do that. Nobody's actually going to get rid of all of it. So there's always going to be somebody who hangs on and says, aha, now I have all the power because I'm the one with the nuclear weapons and nobody else has it. So there's a giant catch-22 there. But the problem is, and I think Chomsky points this out better than anybody else, is that if we don't do the thing that seems impossible, which is nuclear disarmament, well, then eventually those weapons will be used again. It's not a question of if, it's a matter of when. Because the technology exists, and we've already had so many close calls just by accident, where somebody, oh shit, it's showing up on the radar as a nuclear launch towards us, but don't fire because maybe this isn't the real thing, and if we press the button back, that's the end of modern civilization as we know it. So we've already had so many close calls just by accident, so the world is super fucked just on the nuclear threat alone. But then we get into climate change. And that's so devastating because, and again, I don't think anybody even makes the case properly in terms of really telling people the truth. So the real threat, obviously there's sea level rise, and that's a giant issue, and so many coastal cities are in danger and at some point won't exist, but there's water shortage and drought and famine as the real thing here. There are going to be wars over water at some point. You cannot escape the famine. You cannot escape the drought. You cannot escape the skyrocketing food prices. You cannot escape the increase in natural disasters. And it is a civilization destabilizing event. And we're not even taking it seriously. I mean, this government is going in the wrong direction. Never mind the fact that when the Democrats are in power, they go maybe, 10%, 15% in the right direction? But that's only 10 or 15%. It's time for a radical change in how we approach this stuff. It's time to do a New Deal. And as part of that New Deal, we create millions and millions of jobs, but those jobs are directly tied into green and renewable technology so that we get to a point where we're creating jobs, getting off of fossil fuels, and just moving towards a sustainable energy model. Because even if we totally cut off our carbon emissions now, there's still going to be a reverberating effect where climate change is going to get worse for years to come. So, I'm a little pessimistic on this point. I think we may have already reached the tipping point and we're already fucked and there's no going back, which is just so devastating. Chomsky's laying this out brilliantly, but unfortunately, he'll be maligned as a fringe far-left figure who's not a truth teller, but he's just a fucking, guy who's doing the equivalent of right-wing fear-mongering on the left. But the difference is what Chomsky says is actually true, what the fear-mongers on the right say, and what they try to scare you about, like evil, scary brown people, that's not true, and that's silly.